Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. It's so good to have this session put together. We've spent quite a long time planning it, since it originated at the end of January, and we were talking about the reasons why we needed to have a session on this sort of a topic. And before we start, I would just like to say thank you for your attendance and invite Christina Robinson to give a karakia to bless the event. Kia ora. Thank you, Christina. So, not long after the national government came, or whatever you call this government, the shambles came together, we became aware of just how much was going to be changed from the way in which the previous government had set about creating the notion of a well-being society that they had implicit in their economic theory and economic thinking. And we became aware of the fact that one of the things that was going to happen was that social provision was going to be taken down a notch because it was too expensive. We needed to rein in an economy of some sort, and we needed to have tax cuts, and we've seen how all of those have played out. And in the middle of all of that, we started to get indications from government departments that they themselves had expenses that they would rather reduce and stop having to meet. And one of those was the capacity of the police force to respond to 111 calls. They could understand how they would be continue to oblige to respond to crime and to 111 calls about crime that was in progress. They could understand a little bit about how they had to respond to mental health issues, because they were often synonymous with the practicing of or the putting into practice of a criminal risk or danger to people. But they were thinking cautiously or reluctantly about why they would continue to be responding to violence calls and domestic violence calls, notwithstanding the fact that they are charged with a responsibility to do that. And this came upon a lot of other issues that were cranking up at the time around how tenants were being told to improve their behaviour, or they wouldn't be able to stay within accommodation that was provided by the state or by other landlords, and the disability services were being told that they wouldn't be allowed to have the range of services that were available to them. And so we promulgated the idea of addressing this issue, particularly in regard to domestic violence. And I rang some contacts of mine, and I was looking for a panel that would be able to contribute from a research-based point of view around this topic. And the first I got hold of was Debbie, and we had a long chat, and then we got hold of Emma, and then we got hold of Pauline. And from that, we've got ourselves a panel tonight, which I am really looking forward to speaking. We've had several meetings to discuss the content. We have digested some of the material, or the panelists have digested some of the material into a PowerPoint, and we intend to present the material to you by speaking to it, and there will be an opportunity for questions and answers at a later point in the evening's program. And then to finish off, I'd also like to pass a koha bag around in order to just get a contribution towards the issue, supporting the domestic violence industry and communities, and we'll give that money to the Good Shepherd, who are Emma's organisation. So tonight, can I welcome you all and ask Pauline to say a few words to start off with. Pauline.
Sorry, old lady eyes. I'm trying to find a place that's out of the light. So kia ora koutou, ko Pauline Gulliver tōku ingoa. I'm really pleased, honoured to be here talking to you this evening with these wonderful ladies that I have next to me. I just want to start by acknowledging, there's truckloads of people out there who do some amazing work in family violence, domestic violence, intimate partner violence, gender-based violence. Some of these wonderful people are New Zealanders. They work in the disability sector, and I look at Debbie because she's put in immense amounts of time in that. They work in the LGBTIQ communities. They work within Women's Refuge and a whole bunch of other support organisations. And so what we're presenting today is a really, really just a tiny wee nugget of all that work that's out there. The other thing I want to acknowledge before we get into this is just what's happening in Australia. And we look over across the ditch and, keep our fingers crossed that it's not going to happen here. But I think we do have to acknowledge that it's a reflection on some stuff that's going on online at the moment. And that has started to play out and to increase homicide rates for women in Australia. So we certainly hold them dear in our heart, and it's, to be honest with you, it's the worst possible outcomes that we could expect. So we're here tonight really just to provide you with a really brief overview of, it's titled family violence, but Debbie's going to go through a whole bunch of different definitions, and we're going to use some different words at different times, so I deeply apologise for that. And I'm sure that there's contact details out there somewhere, so please just get in touch with us if you need anything clarified. How do we go through the slides? Oh, I go to you. Thank you. Yeah, excellent. So this is what's brought us here. The briefing to the incoming minister that was released in February 2024. And essentially what they suggested was some key opportunities to improve policing outcomes. And there were some tensions around at the time, so I acknowledge that there was an increasing focus on gang activity and gun violence. And so there was an indication from the police that they wanted support to refocus to their core business. And from the family violence perspective, this was quite triggering. And if we move to the next slide, one of the main reasons it was quite triggering for us was because they did actually acknowledge in this briefing to the incoming minister that only a very small proportion of people will report to the police. So the wonderful work by Deb McKenzie and the Backbone Collective supports findings from the New Zealand Crime and Victims Survey, which essentially says that the level of reporting of family harm, as it's described here, or family violence as we describe it, is increasing but remains low. So what we're talking about there is around about 24 to 26% of people will report to police. But police do actually have a role in this. Their role is to investigate offences and to prevent further harm to victims and their whānau. I have to say that investigating offences is separate to preventing harm. So police have a role in administering things called police safety orders. So what they are is essentially police may turn up at a house. They might be concerned that violence has occurred or is about to occur, but there is no evidence of such. At that time, they can issue a police safety order that essentially says to someone, you have to leave the property for 3 to 5 days. Cool down period. And the reason that they will issue that is to prevent escalation. So it's to stop an offence occurring. So essentially this is the whole prevention of further harm arm. So in order for that to happen, you have to be on site, aware of the potential for further harm. So that certainly from our perspective, that was one of those things that is like, oh my goodness, so there's a potential you won't turn up. How then do you do a police safety order? The Backbone Collective also have a couple of really, really, really useful reports out. They describe women's contacts with police, what their responses are, how they view those responses, and suggestions of how that can be improved. And I'm not sure that pulling back is one of those suggestions. Next slide. And I'm handing to... Oh, okay, I'm going to do this. So today's agenda. Now, after this, I'm going to hand to Debbie. So Debbie's going to talk through family violence. What is family violence? The whole bunch of different definitions that I described. The prevalence, inequities and intersectionalities, that's coming back to me. I forgot your name. Emma. Emma is going to go do a deep dive into one form of violence, around economic violence, and this is useful because it's not a physical form of violence, so it's very, very hard to pick up. Debbie's going to come back and talk about other ongoing harm, and then it's going to come back to me to wrap it all up. Lucky! Sorry. So we'll rock on. There's some questions and discussion at the end. I know I'm quite happy to take questions as we go along, and I'm pretty sure these guys are as well, so please, if you've got anything that you want to ask queries about, just flick your hand up and we will try and respond.
Thank you. Next slide, please. I thought I'd start just by talking about the different language, because there's a huge amount of language and I personally find it quite confusing. So family violence, we talk about family violence, which is now the language that's used in the legislation and used generally across the sectors. So family violence is violence that occurs in a family relationship. So it could be parent-to-child violence, parent-to-parent violence, partner-to-partner. It can be child-to-parent violence. It can be older children to an older parent, so elder abuse. And it can be violence in the wider family from siblings, from wider relations, and people who are in a domestic relationship. So family violence has quite a wide context. Domestic violence is the language that we used to use for intimate partner violence, for violence that occurred between intimate partners, whether they were married or not. In family violence, there doesn't need to be a sexual relationship. We generally assume a dating relationship or a sexual relationship in intimate partner violence. But there's not necessarily a sexual relationship. Sexual violence obviously is part of intimate partner and family violence because sexual violence occurs in all those different relationships, but also is slightly different because it can happen from a stranger or from someone that's not within the family group. So we talk about it separately, and it has slightly different dynamics in the way that it's resolved and responded to. Family harm is the language that the police have started using, and no one knows why. And we don't particularly understand why they use it, but I just thought I'd raise it because it's language that's used. And battering's the old language, which some of you will know, which was American language for battered women. We've never tended to use that in New Zealand, but it's language that's known. Next slide, thanks. So the language that we have now comes to us through the different acts. So we had the Domestic Violence Act, we now have the Family Violence Act, and that talks about violence being not just physical violence, but a range of different behaviours, physical, sexual, emotional abuse, and I'm going to talk about coercive control, which is a way that we understand. And it's really important to understand that the violence that we're talking about is not a single incident. It's not me just getting in an argument with Pauline and shouting at her or even shoving her in a single instance. The important thing is that it's a pattern of behaviour over time. And there's patterns of behaviour that we can identify and describe because they're fairly common generally around the world. There's different manifestations in different places, but generally we understand violence as a pattern of these different kinds of behaviour, and there may not be physical violence in a relationship. There may be the threat of violence. There may be other forms of violence that create fear. So it's about creating fear so that someone has control over another person, and the other person is available to be controlled because of that fear. Next one, please. So now we understand violence more as coercive control. And coercive control is using a range of behaviours, as I said, to take power away from a person and have power over them. And I think that taking power away is really important, because it's a whole range of behaviours that undercut somebody's self-esteem and sense of who she is, and therefore her ability to act autonomously. And so coercive control has been described as a human rights violation because it violates someone's right to their own physical, sexual and emotional integrity and their right to their own agency to do what they want to do. And so there's a very good website called Speak Out Loud that describes these different kinds of psychological behaviours. And also that Healthline resource is quite a clear description of coercive control and the different behaviours. And they can be quite subtle. They might be something, you'll have heard about harming pets and harming animals. So rather than harming the woman, the person who's the victim of violence, I might beat the dog to death. Rather than harming her, I might threaten to harm the children or harm her family. I might break the dish that was her grandmother's and that is her memory of her grandmother. So it's a whole lot of different behaviours that build towards a controlling relationship. This diagram here was developed by Shine, who are the Auckland Domestic Family Violence Service. Sorry, I still say domestic violence. And what this talks about is the way that violence traps women and traps victims. So, you know, there's male to female violence, there's female to female violence, there's male to male. Sorry. And what you can see is a range of different behaviours: humiliating someone, keeping them financially dependent, using the children, threatening, if somebody's an immigrant, for example, on someone's visa, threatening to have them deported so they'll never see their children again. Making people do something that harms them or that they don't want to do, to prostitute themselves, to engage in criminal behaviour, forcing someone to use drugs or use alcohol. Monitoring someone's behaviour so that they, through where they go in the car, through who they phone, through their computer use, so that they never feel that they're able to make an independent movement. They're constantly being quizzed about who they're talking to, being jealous, being controlling. So there's a whole range of behaviours. But what really traps people is partly that, which I'll talk about with my spiral in a minute, is partly those behaviours, but then the unhelpful responses from family, from friends, from people in the communities, from organisations that people go to help, who don't understand violence and don't offer the sort of support and help that people need. And then on the outer part of the circle is all the inequities that trap people and prevent them being able to leave. And Emma's going to talk more about the financial entrapment. But if you can flick to the next slide, please. This is from my friend, Dr. Claire Murphy. And she talks about the way that the intersectional risk of power and powerlessness. And what we see is that the people who are most harmed are the people who are at the bottom of these different pyramids of privilege. And you understand all of this privilege. So women are more harmed than men. Older people, children, in fact, just women of any age actually are harmed. So ageism doesn't work that much there. Disabled people are more harmed. people who are from the rainbow community are more harmed than heterosexual people, so that we build this list of who's harmed, and those who are poor, who have less options because they have less money, less options around where to live, less options around being able to move out of a situation, become also more trapped. It's not that there's more violence in poor communities, it's that those in poor communities become more trapped because they have less options. So I just wanted to finish with my spiral, because, and I blame Jennifer for this spiral, thank you Jennifer. I got this from her years ago. But just to understand entrapment, and I'm just going to borrow Emma for a minute. So if I want to have a relationship with Emma, the first thing I do when I meet her is I don't punch her in the nose. That's a really bad thing to do when I first meet her, because she won't like me. So what I do if I want to have a relationship with Emma is I get to know her. I'm a really nice person. I find out everything that she cares about. I find out the things that she doesn't like, the things that she does like, the things that are most important to her, the things she wants to do, her dreams, the things that could interrupt those dreams. I'm a wonderful person. And then one day I say to Emma, "Oh, Emma, I thought you were going to dress up because I wanted to introduce you to my family." And she goes, "Oh, sorry, I'll go and get changed." And I go, "Yep, I got it." Next time, I might go, I'm just going to shove you. I might go, "That wasn't very nice, I didn't like that, and you're going to apologise." Got her again. And what happens over time, thank you, is that these incidents often get worse. They can get emotionally worse, physically worse, sexually worse, and over time they get closer. When I do that, I'm going to say sorry. "Oh, I'm really sorry, Emma, I didn't mean to push you. That was really horrible. I'm sorry, let's go out for dinner." "I'm really sorry, Emma, I didn't mean to do that. Here's a gift." Thank you. What happens over time is that my sorry gets less because I don't need to say sorry, because the fear and the control is building, and Emma is getting increasingly trapped, and it's increasingly difficult for her to get out of this situation because I've quite lately alienated her family, her friends, I've isolated her. I'm the main source of information, and I'm the person who controls what she does and who she sees. And I'm quite likely the person who controls her finances and where she lives and a whole lot of other things. And if she's a disabled person and I'm her carer, if she's an elderly person and I'm her carer, she's very trapped. If I've addicted her to drugs and I'm her dealer, she's very trapped.
He koiora matapapore is the New Zealand Family Violence Study, and it was done in 2019. The lead researcher for it was Janet Farnslow and Tracy McIntosh. And it gives us some pretty useful information on prevalence. So when we're talking about prevalence, it's how many people within the community have experienced whatever it is that we're seeking to understand. The survey itself uses the World Health Organization questionnaire as a way of measuring violence. And there's strengths and limitations to everything, but essentially what it does is breaks violence down to a series of different acts to try and get people, because if we went out and asked people, is your husband beating you, we'd only find out about physical violence. And it's really, really difficult to actually ask people about emotional abuse and psychological violence. So you have to break it down into the types of acts that people might use. So the survey included both men and women. and it included people who were aged 15 years and over. And essentially what this graph shows you, so as you go from light to dark, you're getting an increased frequency, and you're also getting, so here we've got more severe types of physical violence, and we also have more severe types of psychological abuse. So what we did was look at, we compared men and women for how often they experience violence and severe types of violence they experienced. I'm sorry, I'm moving around quite a lot, aren't I? So the great debate out there is domestic violence gendered? And essentially what this shows is that when you compare men and women will experience more frequent violence, they will experience more severe violence. And what we also know is that they experience more severe outcomes of violence. So in our family violence homicide statistics, 76% of 76% of those who are killed as a result of intimate partner violence are women. And they are generally killed at the hands of men. So we know that it is a gendered crime because women experience it more frequently, they experience it more severely, and they experience more serious outcomes as a result. Can we go to the next slide? And they're more frightened, yes, exactly. And it also disproportionately impacts on disabled people and tangata whaikaha Māori. So when Debbie was talking about these intersectionalities before, again, we have really, really strong evidence that this is the case. As you can see there, the purple lines are people who have at least one disability. The yellow lines are people with no disabilities. And the prevalence of physical intimate partner violence, sexual intimate partner violence, psychological intimate partner violence, controlling behaviours and economic abuse for both men and women who have a disability is quite a lot higher than people who don't have a disability. Next slide. So, and I've only done this for women because we know that, as I mentioned before, that women experience more serious outcomes and more frequent serious outcomes. So where women reported that they had experienced intimate partner violence or any type of intimate partner violence, they are more likely to have mental health conditions, so almost 3 times more likely to have a mental health condition. They're twice as likely to report poor general health, 1.5 times more likely to experience a physical health condition, so things like cancer, heart disease, strokes, increased likelihood of recent pain or discomfort, and more likely to also see healthcare providers. So it's a health issue, and it's interesting because quite often we have the most difficulty trying to get the health community to understand that violence is a health issue. If we impact on women's experience of violence, then we will quite substantially impact on the health outcomes that they also experience. Next slide, please.
Thank you. Got a question.
Oh.
Has anybody sort of made the correlation between stress and which is, I mean, you know, people who experience violence have stress, and it's probably for a long term, and it's probably triggered by other things. And is there anything that looks at that impact on long-term health?
Yes. So there's quite a bit of work in the States that looks at adverse childhood experiences, and essentially what they showed that people who have adverse childhood experiences, so a whole range of different things, but violence is included in that, before the age of 18 have significantly worse health outcomes. From that work, they also started talking about this thing called toxic stress. So normally what would happen in your life is you go, stressful event, relax, stressful event, relax. light in your eyes, stressful event, relax. And so your body has a chance to recover. But where you don't have that recovery phase, then you end up with essentially a really high level of cortisol. I'm not a public health physician, so there's probably people in the audience or who are going, anyway, but essentially what the research shows is that you end up with this really high level, and that has been associated with health outcomes. So yes, the research is there, it exists, and yes, we know that it is a fact.
And so yes, in response to your question, there's a number of diseases now, chronic diseases, that are starting to be associated with the understanding of that long-term toxic stress that Pauline was talking about. And Kathy Lowe at Auckland Hospital has actually started compiling a list of those diseases which should raise red flags around the potential risk of long-term sexual or family violence.
Yes.
I was a professor of biomedical research for 25 years, many years ago, and I can assure you that you're fairly tight on the mark. And there is a growing body of research data looking at the biochemical and physiological basis behind that, showing that it's real, showing that there really are biochemical, physiological things going on in the body that are measurable, that you can see, that cause this change in health. How long that takes to get to the clinical scientists, I can't speak to, but I can tell you that on the research side, there is a vast body of research looking at that.
Thank you. And the other thing I think in response to that as well is that that's why it's such a critical issue when we're thinking about intergenerational violence exposure. So like the experience of violence, as Debbie was saying, you know, if you're thinking about coercive control, one of the easiest ways to control a woman is through her child. But as a result of that, what you're doing is you're exposing that child from a very, 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 very young age, actually more than likely from pregnancy, to high levels of stress. And so when you're talking about, you know, when does it get to a clinical stage? If you're exposed to it all your life?
So when it gets to the clinical stage, I meant the things that we study, medical things that we study on the research side.
Oh.
Clinical doctors are not allowed to use them until they've gone through a certain level of testing and been approved for clinical use.
Mm.
The research is there to show that it's real. However, that research has not all of that research has made it into the clinical usage yet.
Mm.
Certainly the clinical effects on people are quite dramatic and substantial.
Yep. And we also, going back to what I was saying about pregnancy-related violence, we know that, you know, women experience violence when they are pregnant. For some women, violence escalates in pregnancy as well.
Thank you. So I wanted to do a little bit of a deep dive into one form of family violence and then also one aspect of the harm related to family violence. So I've put on the left-hand side there the three, in the legislation there are three types of abuse that is noted in the family violence legislation, as Debbie went through before. There's physical abuse, sexual abuse and psychological abuse. And then within psychological abuse, there's a bunch of different things that might constitute psychological abuse, and many of them Debbie has mentioned in her examples. There's threats, there's intimidation, there's harassment, there's damage to property, there's ill treatment of significant animals, I think is what the legislation says, whether that be pets or a service animal, beloved pets. There's financial or economic abuse, withdrawal of health care if you need it, and for children being exposed to the abuse of another. So I really want to dig into this concept for a little bit of financial and economic abuse. And then all of those forms of abuse can relate to a bunch of harms. So physical harm, reproductive consequences, mental stress, etc. One of those is the economic harm that results from family violence. So I'm keen to talk about a little bit of both of those, because sometimes when we think about the financial aspect of family violence, people can merge those two things a little bit, and they're quite separate, although related, if you know what I mean. Thank you. So financial and economic abuse, like I've said, it is a form of family violence within psychological abuse. Debbie ran through some examples before, and I've listed some of them here. Definitely limiting access to money and money for favours. So Good Shepherd, the organisation that I'm with, one of the services that we run, we exist to support women and girls who are experiencing harm or hardship. And one of the services that we have is in the area of family violence, economic harm, and within that we see lots of examples of financial and economic abuse within what our client has experienced. And certainly limiting access to money is a really big one. So, literally saying you can't have any money this week because you haven't been good to me, or I will give you money if you do this act for me. Coercing people into joint debt is a really big one. So actually I want to go and buy a ute, or I'm going to go to the TAB or whatever. We're going to get a joint debt together, and being coerced into that. Also unapproved debt. So getting, using somebody's credit rating, their good credit score, to get debt that they haven't actually said that they're willing to sign up to. Certainly damaging property. We see a lot of clients whose phone has been smashed, whose car has been smashed, whose window has been smashed, whose whatever has been smashed, and that's then on the person who has experienced the abuse to sort out. Same with rental properties. So as a tenant, they'll find that they come home and their rental property has been smashed, and that's then on them and a situation with them and their landlord. Forcing people to work or preventing people from work is absolutely something that we see, and as a form of very obvious, I think, financial and economic abuse. We see lots of people being limited to their own bank account, somebody going in and changing the password, having access to all the money and limiting the other person's access to the money in the bank accounts. We see instances of where dobbing in with, say, for example, WINS or Inland Revenue, where the partner might ring up and say, oh, this person's actually been working, they just haven't told you about it. Might be true, might not be true, but it's that kind of spreading of information, which has some pretty important financial and economic consequences. We also see abuse via bank transactions. So, for example, if you have been ordered to pay some child support or something like that, if you do a transaction, you can put you put the particulars in the reference. So somebody might be seeing each week when their child support comes through on their transactions, you effing whore, or something like that. It could be the abuse that they receive through their bank accounts. So the banks, for example, are really important partners. Hello. Hello. Oh, hello. There we go. Banks are really important partners for us in this.
I am from a bank, and I am in our community banking division. And that's one of the things that we're looking at in regard of abuse and transactions. And it could be something vile like that. Mm-hmm. And if it's something vile, it will get picked up by our banking system, and it will be reported. We have what we call an extra care manager who goes, and if it's, in our case, an ASB customer who's being abusive, we go to them, we give them warnings. Some of them, it might be silly or jokes, and we say, well, it's not funny, stop it. And if it don't stop it, then you have the right to close their accounts. And also, and it could be, as I said, something vile, or it could well be something sinister, and it might be a whole lot of 1 cent transactions, and it might be, I'm watching you, I see what you're wearing, and it might be 20 or 30 of those transactions a day, but 1 cent each, and those can also be reported. Certainly in our case, we have someone, an extra care manager who looks at that, and we can also liaise with other banks to stop that type of thing.
Thank you. Thank you. You can see how some of these examples, I mean, this spiral of entrapment is going to be very clear. Thanks, Paul. So with financial and economic abuse, you know, as we've said, it is a form of violence in its own right. It is often part of the overall picture of violence, but also sometimes not. There's some really important things to note around the fact that, you know, as Pauline said at the beginning, financial and economic abuse is often a bit harder to spot from an outside point of view. Very lucky that the banks can help with that in a lot of ways, but it can be quite hard to spot. And there has been a recent example of, you know, there's been no physical violence, but financial and economic abuse has been present until a time where, you know, a woman was shot to death. Do you want to say anything more about that example? No. Okay. As I've mentioned, the financial service providers are really important in spotting financial and economic abuse, and the data and algorithms that are used are getting better and better all the time, as is the staff and their daily interactions and what they might be sort of seeing and hearing, and we work really closely with the banks for that reason. That said, kind of alongside that, it can be really tough because sometimes the financial innovations and procedures can actually exacerbate the problem. So if it's really easy to get a loan online, then it's pretty easy for me to get a loan for somebody who I don't have authority to get a loan with online, for example. We have some issues around automatically informing the other party of certain things, which is a procedural thing and often not helped by the legislation. I was talking to a banker today, actually, sorry Ian, I was talking to a banker today about a couple of situations that they've had over the last month where the woman has a protection order and also an occupancy order. So they've been enabled to stay in the home and to take control of that home while her abuser has been asked to not be in the home. From a bank's point of view, I hope that I'm getting this quite right, but from a bank's point of view, with the occupancy order, where there's a home loan in place, the person who's remaining in the home then has whole responsibility for the repayments and the lending of that. And the banker that I was speaking to said, I really, you know, this person was really struggling to make those home loan repayments, which she was now solely responsible for because the occupancy order was in place. Reached out to their hardship team to say, can we just put this person on a payment holiday, essentially, a home loan repayment holiday? And they said, yeah, but we have to, because it's a joint account, we actually have to legally loop in the other account holder, who is her abuser, who she would prefer not to have this conversation with. So there's some procedural regulatory stuff. That was the Triple CFA, the Consumer Credits and Contracts Act, required that. So there's some procedural stuff that makes it really, really tough for people trying to help in these situations as well. I do want to call out, you know, Pauline and I were talking about this the other day, the tenacity and the smarts of people experiencing family violence. Sometimes that can alleviate the pressure and make it harder to spot when it's happening, because they figure out how to make life work in the best way possible. So if my money's being controlled, unless a hundred different examples, but if my money's being controlled and I can't get access to get the things that I need, I'll figure out how to barter for things, or I'll figure out how to grow my own, or I'll figure out how to, show up in a way that doesn't look like I'm being controlled or harmed in that way. And that's a real credit to people in this situation. It is absolutely tenacity, smarts, and it can make it harder to spot when somebody's going through this. Thank you. This is another graph from the study that Pauline was referencing before. This is actually a draft, so just have to be a little bit careful with this. It's a draft that's been shared with us for the pre-release. What this is showing is the association between women's experience of inter-partner violence that did not involve financial and economic abuse compared with anything that included financial and economic abuse, and how that impacts your mental health. So a little bit associated with the conversation that we were having before about stress. The mental health impact is elevated. The red line shows the mental health, elevated poor mental health outcomes of women who have experienced financial and economic abuse as part of the violence. So blue line where there was no financial and economic abuse, but there were other forms of family violence, and red when there was. Kind of crazy, eh? Next one, please. Okay, so that's the abuse side. And then I mentioned before that regardless of which form of violence has occurred, there's often economic harm from family violence. This is, for me, one of the curiosities Debbie mentioned before around how policing have changed from talking about family violence and family abuse to harm, and I think it's quite a curious relabelling. So if we look at the economic harm from family violence, it's huge. It's huge. It can cause really serious economic harm. The access to employment is one really clear example. If I have been prevented from going to work in the first part, obviously that's going to be tough to get a job and maintain a job. If I've been physically injured and I cannot really feel like I can show up, or I'm physically unable to do my work, it's going to have an impact on my access to employment. If I'm being harassed in the workplace, or I am, showing up and my partner is there and causing an unsafe workplace for my colleagues, it's going to have an impact on my access to employment. If my car's been smashed up, it's going to have an impact on my access to employment, and all of these things cause really massive economic harm for the person who's experiencing the violence. It absolutely puts people in a tougher place, very hard to rebuild if you haven't got money. So if you're seeking to leave and part of your safety plan is that you need a phone and you haven't got money for a phone, that's really hard. If you need to move cities to be safe, you have to physically move. The costs of moving are very large, actually. If you've got a bad credit rating, it's hard to rebuild. The compounding of the harm financially and economically is really quite stunning. And yet, financial capital and resilience, you need those things to stay safe. So not only are you in a situation where you've got no access to your bank accounts potentially, or you've got a bad credit rating, or you've got a lot of debt that's mounting up, at the time where you need to pay bond on a new rental property and move to a new city and establish a new network and have a car and a phone for safety's sake. So it's a very tricky space to be spiraled down into. Indeed.
So that's an added burden.
It absolutely is.
Even after you've decided to separate, you've gone through that whole procedure, but then if you've got a joint mortgage, you have to, so that's a huge financial.
And you may not feel able or willing to fight for your half either. You might just think, actually, just take what you need, just let me out of here. So it's, thank you for mentioning that. I think, so I mentioned that we have a service that helps people who have experienced economic harm as a result of family violence. We did a 1-year pilot with one dedicated person because it's what we could muster and we wanted to see if it was going to work. It's now in its second year with 2 dedicated specialists, which I'm very pleased about. But we still have to limit access. So we haven't been able to go out and shout from the rooftops about this as much as we'd like to because demand is definitely outstripping supply. We could have a team of 15 people and still have not enough people to help. What we do is often alongside a family violence advocate and or a financial mentor, and we walk alongside to support the client, predominantly women. We offer no interest loans. We offer advocacy to dismantle unjust debt. So I mentioned some of the debt that might have been created in somebody's name that they didn't consent to, or that they were coerced into because of the family violence. So we work to kind of dismantle that. We negotiate debt reductions with creditors. We provide little grants to help where we can. And we certainly are also advocating with creditors and working with fantastic people like our colleagues at ASB and others to put systems in place to prevent and recover from harm. It is often hardship. What did I say on the other one? Sorry. It says often hardship but different from hardship. I just really want to point out that some of the clients that we work with, they may not be in financial hardship, but there is an awful lot of economic harm occurring, and those are 2 quite different things. Thank you. So in the pilot, for this 1 year with this one person, just to kind of give you a bit of a gist of it, there were just under 156 clients through that year. That one's quite hard to say, but that's just our referrals, where we got sort of referrals from. 94% of our clients were female. They came to us with about $630,000 in total debt, which we managed to reduce through various forms of debt relief. By, I don't know what percentage that is off the top of my head, but let's say a third. And the average debt relief for each of those clients was about $8,500, which doesn't sound like a lot, but actually is a lot. And if we've got time, I think on my next slide, I was just going to give you kind of one example of how this all comes together. Is that okay if I just read you out an example? Okay, so we've been working with a client recently who came to us actually by way of a fantastic financial mentor. The financial mentor recognised that there was economic harm as a result of family violence and wasn't sure how to proceed, and so came to us, which was fantastic. This client was a woman, a Māori woman, living in rural Wairarapa. She had 7 children, she had a grandchild, all living with her in a house that she owned. Due to episodes of family violence, the police had actually removed her from the house because they were finding it hard to remove her abuser. So it was her house, she owned it, but they removed her and the children from the house, and she went to live with her mother, with the children, while her partner, her now ex-partner, remained in the house. The woman and her children and grandchild all slept on the floor at her mum's house, and they all just made it work. And they worked that way for over a year. After obtaining a protection order and a year of court processes, her ex-partner was incarcerated. At that point, she'd been working very closely with Women's Refuge. She'd been working with Work and Income. She'd been working with a financial mentor because she'd found that she'd kind of come out of this with a lot of relationship debt. So during the relationship, the couple had received a benefit. He had controlled all the money and made all the financial decisions. She was forced to have all of the debts in her name, and the bills only got paid if he wanted to, and a lot of that meant if she did what he wanted her to do. His control went so far as to not letting her open her own emails, not letting her open her own mail at all. Recently, she was able to return to her home because he was now incarcerated, and she found that a lot of bills had not been paid. the power was in arrears and cut off, the mortgage was in a bad state, the rates had not been paid for some time, and unfortunately due to a pretty bad credit rating that she'd kind of he had created through this relationship for her, the mortgage had now been put onto a third tier lender with really high cost. The debts were out of control. So the day that we were contacted, we were told that the house was actually going to mortgagee auction because of the unpaid debts. Now, in some situations, while I'm not a financial advisor, a mortgagee sale is actually quite a good outcome. In this situation, it was not. The Economic Harm Service, our service, we made contact with that third tier lender that the mortgage was at. And we found out that on top of the mortgage, can I keep going? I'm about halfway through. Is that all right? Yeah, okay. It's a happy ending. On top of the mortgage, there was an additional car loan. So he had taken out a car loan under their name for $9,000 from another high-cost lender, that the caveat on that loan for the car was the house. And the car loan had now increased from the $9,000 that it was originally to $30,000. And that was the house of cards that was causing the prompting of the mortgagee sale. And after many, many, many meetings and discussions through a very short period of time, the wonderful staff, like I said, there's one of them, now there's two of them, and the financial mentor and the wonderful advocate at Women's Refuge, we did manage to halt the sale of the house, which is great. We got a new contract negotiated. We changed the lending rate. We managed to do some negotiations there, and so the house was saved, which was good. I contacted other creditors and collections agencies. We managed to get some debts wiped, power wiped, afterpay wiped, which is a bit of a miracle because buy now, pay later doesn't really roll in that way, so that was good. And the other thing that we managed to do with our wonderful, wonderful credit partner, Centrix, was to have all of the outstanding defaults removed from her credit rating. So it improved her good credit rating because we were able to say, hey, she was coerced into these. This wasn't actually her, it was her abuser and the situation. And that makes a massive, massive difference when your credit rating can be kind of reset a bit. Conversations with the council, we were given a rebate so overall, cut long story short, significantly reduced debt, significantly better outcome. The client continues to have about $20,000 debt to government through work and income, but with the lower repayments, she's now able to start paying back them. She worked with a financial mentor to find other ways to support the family. The police flexi fund, which I didn't know that this was a thing, was access to get new beds for the children. She got a small community grant for some marakai, some veggie gardens and some veggie beds, and we also just sent her some we do little grants, which if we do have any koha tonight, this is how we'll be using it, straight into the hands of the clients that we work with, to make sure that her cupboards were full of food for the next few weeks, because when she walked into her house that she owned, after a year of sleeping on the floor elsewhere, there was no power, there was no food, there was nothing but debt. So we spoke to her the other day, and she, wanted to pass on through all the work that she felt like a new person. She said that she feels like she's starting a new life as a new woman, and is now working with her children to kind of help them work through these experiences. So thank you for indulging me with that story. I know it was really long, but you can see how interconnected it all is, and how the harm just compounds and spirals. And I really wanted to share that with you. Thank you. Do I go on any further? No. Thanks.
So just before Pauline sums up for us, I wanted to just remind you of what you've heard, the different kinds of harm that women experience. And Pauline showed you slides of the sort of the health effects. So people are experiencing, as we talked about, extreme stress, which is causing physical injury and physical harm people have physical injuries that they may or may not be able to get properly healed. So they may or may not be able to go to the doctor. So people sometimes have, incorrectly healed bones and things like that cause ongoing harm, ongoing pain. High rates of head injury, which we haven't talked about. So women suffering the confusion, short-term memory loss, the headaches, the pain of living with traumatic brain injury. And I went to a conference about it recently where they talked about a fragile brain. So the more often a brain gets harmed, the more easily a brain gets harmed. And so women are often living with constant pain and confusion because of having their head hit against the floor, against the wall, by being punched, by being shaken. Living with self-harming behaviours, so with alcohol use, with drug use, with controlling eating, different ways of trying to take control of the situation or medicate the situation, and all of the mental distress that Pauline talked about, that Emma talked about, the distress of unwanted pregnancies, the distress of not having control over your own body when you have sex or don't have sex, whether you use contraception or don't use contraception, the stress of having your behaviours and your relationships controlled, all of those things, and the intense distress that causes. And over all of that, I think that we must never underestimate just what living in fear does to people. And you all know that moment when you're frightened in the night, for example, and you hear something and your whole body's adrenalized and your heart's pounding, your breathing's shallow, you can't sleep. So these women are often exhausted because they're not sleeping. They're hypervigilant because they're reading the room all of the time. They're frightened all the time. And so what we start seeing is people who are lacking concentration, perceived to be not making good decisions, people who aren't necessarily doing what seems to be in their best interests, and yet they're struggling to survive through all of these harmful effects that are impacting on their minds and bodies. And so I think, just before I pass on to Pauline, what I want to finish by saying is that it's extraordinary that they're alive and they're functioning in any way at all. And I think that we should always remember that women are always resilient, are always resisting, and are always working towards that point that Emma was talking about. Thanks, Pauline.
Thank you. So I get to, can we go to the next slide? I get to bring it back to where we started from. And so this was the spiral that Debbie put up right at the start. And Debbie talked about it in terms of entrapping a woman into a relationship. But I want to bring it back to how ineffective responses further entrap her. And so if we think about the example that we opened with, can we just flick to the next slide? No, next one? Oh my goodness, there we go. I'm going to have to go back. But so what we know is that people don't first pick up the phone to the police. Like, that's not the first response. Or there's a very small chunk of people that do. But it's generally not the first response. So what we see is that women will cope until they can't cope. And then they'll talk to friends or family, because actually there's a lot of shame with violence. So they'll start talking to friends and family. So that's why we've got this big informal circle going on here, right? And then when that's not working for them, then they look to formal services. Then we reach out to people like police, health services. And if we've got that far down the track and the response that we're getting isn't effective, then it's debilitating. So if we go back to that, thank you. So if you can put yourself in a situation where she's got to the end, she's got to her limits, and she starts to talk to her family, and they get to their limits, and then she speaks to a helping agency, and they say, well, actually, we don't think you're severe enough. And then he finds out that she phoned. And then what happens? She could get beaten. She might not get beaten. She might just get some other form of violence. So her next thought is, what do I do next? Who do I reach out to? Who is my opportunity to help me get out of this relationship? So if we move to the next slide, please. So that's where, when we talk about entrapment, that's what we're referring to as where government policies and legislation can further trap women in these relationships. And it is about lack of access to safe and affordable housing, about benefits sanctions, about cutting disabled people's support and independence, about lack of protection around enduring power of attorney. So we were talking about, Debbie started off this conversation talking about if your abuser is also your carer, then where do you go for help? So we have things like enduring power of attorney where people have the right to determine what is in your best interests, and we don't have a monitoring mechanism for that. Law Commission currently got submissions on that, by the way. There are legal means of actually entrapping people. Can we go to the next slide? So the Family Violence Death Review Committee produced a report last year, and within that report they looked at the disconnect between what people sought help for and what they were provided help by. And essentially what they found was that the nature of the response that they were given was more determined by an agency's mandate than what people were actually seeking help for. So there was a massive disconnect between what people were looking for and what they were being provided with. And as a result, you ended up with these missed opportunities to help. And so that's where we talk about that spiralling pattern of entrapment again. And within the report, there's this quote that the committee was frequently able to identify interactions with agencies that agencies had with victims and offenders or family or whānau that didn't allow people to be experts in their own lives. So they took what people were reporting and they reinterpreted it into what they provide for service delivery, rather than allowing people to be an expert in their own life and saying, this is my experience, this is how it's making me feeling, this is what I want you to help me with. Next slide. And the next slide. So we started off talking about the police potential response, and within the briefing to the incoming minister, they also had a proof of concept where it's a phone-based triaging system. And the thing about triaging or risk assessment in any form is what we find is that it ends up putting a threshold. So in order for you to receive services, you have to be more severe than that. And so what we see over time is you have people who are going along this threshold where it starts to escalate, and only when that starts to escalate do we decide that they're serious enough to be in receipt of services. And unfortunately, if we got them a lot earlier, what we'd do is we'd reduce the harm that they're experiencing, would result in this trusting relationship, we'd be able to walk alongside people, and we'd be able to think about their wider family or whānau that's going along this journey with them. So rather than setting these thresholds of risk that people need to meet or exceed in order to receive services, what we really need to be thinking about is how can we get in really, really early before the violence starts or when it's at a very, very early stage in here, so that people are aware of what's going on, can take action and can get themselves and their kids to a safer place. Thank you.
sure you've been in places where the speaker has not quite a lot to say, a question around not quite a lot to say, but we are looking for questions. So can I ask for questions from the audience? Thank you.
Sorry to be a questioner, but do you find that the perpetrators of violence often have been experienced that been abused or experienced that themselves?
So the question is about, have the perpetrators of violence been abused themselves? I'm going to answer from my point of view, is that yes, some abusers have been abused, but many also haven't. This is about the way we socialise people around power and control and how we understand relationships. So it's not just intergenerational abuse. There's a whole lot of other things underpinning it. And we need to remember that while a whole lot of boys have been harmed in the situations of family violence, more girls have been harmed. And so if you became an abuser because you'd been abused, there'd be girls and women all over the country beating people up and killing them, and there aren't.
Yeah, I agree with what Debbie's just said. I think what we see is that there are definitely some men who've had a very traumatic upbringing themselves, while there's also a group for whom it's more about entitlement and expectation. Yeah, it's an unpalatable reality, unfortunately, that some just expect that women will conform to their views. No, I won't.
Next question.
Next question.
Yes.
Thank you. The intersecting, obviously, there's a Venn diagram there, and they are overlapping. But some of the women that we work with, and some of the men, some of the people that we work with, have experienced huge economic harm. So their economic situation is significantly worse because of family violence than if they had not experienced that family violence. But they are still high income earning. I mean, credit to them, honestly. High income earning, still managed to hold on to some of their earning potential and their savings account, even within this huge amount of economic harm that has occurred. And so they're not actually experiencing financial hardship. They're not living below the poverty line, for example, but there's still a huge amount of harm that has occurred. Does that help? Yeah, cool. There's a question here.
So I work in the family harm space. I work for a charity called Kids Need Dads, and we work with men. And one of the challenges that I find is that the question for you is, what is there to help men not be violent? What I'm finding in my work is that our society does not seem to have a paradigm for how a man is supposed to behave that is not inappropriate. And so we're struggling. We're working hard trying to teach men to be the kinds of dads the kids need, the kind of fathers those families need. And that's what else is there out there to support men to before they become violent, or to learn how not to be violent?
Such a good prompt.
So there's a NGO in Christchurch called He Wakatapu, who do an amazing amount of really, really good work in this area. And they also have a national helpline as well, that you don't have to be in Christchurch or one of their clients, you can just pick up the phone. There's a number of really, I've forgotten, Hawke's Bay. No. Sorry. Oh, it will come to me. But there's a group on the Hawke's Bay who've done some fantastic work in this area as well. Can't get them on my mind right now. If you wanted research in this field, there's a guy called Michael Roguski that's written on this, there's actually a lot of work out there. There's a guy in Australia who's done a heap of work. Yeah, we'll get them. We'll send an email to Phil once we've, downloaded all the brain stuff.
Is that new website in your hands?
Yep. MSD. Yeah, She's Not Your Rehab does some stuff as well. So I agree with you. It has been very, very limited up until now, but there's a body of work that's starting to be generated, and it's really, really good stuff. I do have to say, a lot of it's Māori and Pacific. So I think that the challenge is for European men to start thinking about what they need as well, because some of these things are culturally aligned.
I just want to. I don't need that. Do I? Oh. I just want to thank the three of you for emphasising psychological violence, because that's a huge part of all forms of family violence, and also it's not recognised by the police. So they just don't see it. If you go and report family violence, they just don't see it. And, psychological violence. So I belong to a group called AVA, Anti-Violence Action. Some of us are here tonight. And at the moment we're focusing on getting a new law criminalising stalking. And of course stalking is a very dangerous form of psychological violence. And we're hoping that once this law is passed, the police will then have to be educated about the law so that they can implement it, and that will raise awareness of psychological violence. Yeah. So please sign our petition, which you'll find on Action Station's website.
Protect Women, Make Stalking Illegal.
Thank you. It's called Protect Women, Make Stalking Illegal. Thanks.
Thanks, Leonie.